Karen Allen was once a face Hollywood believed would never disappear. In a single moment, she stood at the center of the greatest adventure film of its era. Strong, free-spirited, irreplaceable. The public saw a heroine. Hollywood saw a star. And then she vanished. No scandal, no retirement announcement, no dramatic collapse for the press to cling to. Only a silence that stretched across decades, as if someone who once stood at the very heart of the spotlight had deliberately stepped out of the frame and never looked back. Why would an actress who had reached the very place everyone dreams of walk away from it all? Why would an icon of female strength choose a life beyond the public gaze? And what truly happened behind the glow of fame, the part the audience was never told? To understand that disappearance, we cannot begin in Hollywood. We must return to where the story truly began, before the fame, before the lights, and before Karen Allen became an icon. The world thought it understood. Karen Allen was born on October 5, 1951, in Carrollton, Illinois, a small, quiet town that offered no hint of spotlights or fame. Yet the paradox lies here. Karen did not grow up there. Her father worked in the travel and hospitality industry, a career that required the family to move constantly. Karen's childhood unfolded across multiple cities, multiple states, and even stretches of time living abroad. No house lasted long enough to become a true home. No community endured long enough to create a sense of belonging. That environment shaped a child who became more accustomed to leaving than staying. Karen learned early how to observe the world from the outside rather than rooting herself in any fixed place. While other children formed their identities through family, school, and long-standing friendships, Karen built hers through change, through rapid adaptation, emotional self-containment, and a quiet understanding that stability could never be assumed. There was no broken home, no dramatic tragedy, yet the absence of an anchor became her first fracture. A fracture difficult to name, not sharp, not loud, but deep enough to form a silent survival mechanism. Karen learned not to place her whole self into any system that could be taken away. Whether a house, a city, or later on, a spotlight. In that environment, Karen turned to art not as an escape, but as a refuge. Acting, theater, and creative expression allowed her to pause the constant movement outside and listen to the movement within herself. There, she did not need to belong to any place, only to exist fully in the moment, and from a childhood lived in a perpetual state of temporary, Karen Allen stepped into adulthood with a clear instinct to seek freedom but never allow herself to be bound, not even when the lights of Hollywood began to call her name. After a childhood defined by constant movement, Karen Allen entered adulthood in the early 1970s with a mindset she already knew well. Nothing was guaranteed. She left traditional schooling to pursue acting with full seriousness, spending her early years in experimental theater and stage productions, places where money was scarce, audiences were thin, and every role could just as easily be the last. In 1978, Karen touched film for the first time with a small role in Animal House. It was not an explosion, not a breakthrough, merely a moment in front of the camera before returning to the familiar quiet. Hollywood noticed her, but did not yet need her. In the years that followed, Karen continued to take scattered roles, living in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing whether her name would be called again the following year. By the early 1980s, as many of her peers began moving decisively toward commercial paths, Karen Allen remained with less secure choices: theater, supporting roles, and projects that promised little visibility. She was not immediately cast aside, but neither was she favored. Each audition became another confrontation with being labeled not distinctive enough, not the right mold, difficult to market. And then, in 1981, when Raiders of the Lost Ark arrived, Karen Allen did not step into the role of Marion Ravenwood as someone waiting for her life to change. She entered it the same way she had lived for a decade, without staking her entire sense of self on the outcome. And for that very reason, when the spotlight suddenly descended, it did not merely open the door to a peak, it ignited a new paradox, deeper and far more dangerous. Karen Allen's peak cannot be understood through her personal journey alone. It was the product of a very specific cultural moment, a moment when Hollywood, audiences, and the media all needed an image exactly like hers. Karen Allen's rise began in 1981, when Raiders of the Lost Ark struck straight into the collective memory. But what truly matters is this: Karen Allen did not reach the summit simply because the film succeeded. She rose because the machinery that creates stardom was already in place, and she happened to be its perfect final piece. This was the moment when tastes began to shift. Early 1980s audiences were tired of female leads who merely stood beside the hero. They wanted a woman with real vitality, with instinct, pride, and the visible scrapes of lived experience. Marion Ravenwood stepped precisely into that gap, and Karen Allen made her feel less like a designed feminist archetype and more like a person who had already survived a life. That sense of authenticity made audiences believe. And once belief is there, stardom no longer needs an invitation. It ignites on its own. Her talent was never showy. Karen did not dominate the screen through theatrical force. She did it through credibility. Marion was strong, but not coldly invincible. She could be drunk, angry, fragile, even ruthless when hurt. That complexity allowed the character to live far beyond a single season of spectacle. And so when the film became a phenomenon, Karen Allen's public image formed almost organically. In a rare way, a different kind of leading woman, unflashy, unpolished, untouched by scandal. A face that felt safe in a Hollywood addicted to performance. Luck was perfectly placed as well. Being cast in a global blockbuster is not something everyone gets, but luck is only the wind. What filled the sails was Karen Allen herself, because she did not ruin the moment by chasing the spotlight. She let the character speak for her, and that allowed the media to amplify the Karen Allen phenomenon in a uniquely restrained direction, not as a distant icon, but as a woman who could plausibly exist beyond the screen. Recognition came immediately. Her portrayal of Marion earned Karen Allen the Saturn Award for Best Actress in 1981, a clear acknowledgement that this was not merely a role in a hit movie, but a performance with real weight. Yet instead of staying within that safe mold, Karen quickly pivoted toward choices that signaled her desire to be seen as a serious actor. In 1982, she appeared in Shoot the Moon and Split Image. Then in 1984, she starred in Starman as Jenny Hayden, fragile, inward, emotionally exposed, and received yet another Saturn Award nomination for Best Actress. Alongside film, Karen also returned to the New York stage. In 1982, she appeared on Broadway in The Monday After the Miracle, earning the Theatre World Award in 1983. A milestone that confirmed she was not merely the face of adventure cinema, but an actor with rigorous theatrical foundations. And here is the crucial point: why this success fit Karen Allen as a person. Because her stardom was not built on perfection, but on vitality. Someone who grew up in motion, Accustomed to observing, accustomed to standing on her own, when placed on screen, naturally created a kind of leading woman who needed no explanation. Karen Allen fit that era because she never had to strain to appear strong. She simply existed, and audiences felt it was right. But precisely because the image was formed so completely, the first pressure of fame began tightening at the height of brilliance itself. When the public loved Karen Allen as Marion Ravenwood, they unconsciously wanted her to remain that version forever. From that point on, every other choice was subjected to a cruel question. If she was no longer Marion, then who was she? And perhaps it was that question, more than any visible crisis, that first began to exhaust Karen Allen, long before any true upheaval had time to arrive. After the peak, Karen Allen did not face a loud, dramatic fall. What came first was a subtle misalignment, barely noticeable, yet persistent. Hollywood still called her name, but the tone had changed. Offers shaped by familiar echoes, roles measured against old memories. The spotlight that once lifted her now hardened into a frame. The pressure of fame did not arrive as scandal, but as repetition. The media noticed something unusual about a star who refused to repeat a formula. Fans clung to an image they loved, unconsciously wishing it to remain unchanged. And Karen Allen, who had once turned to acting as a place of refuge, began to feel the constriction of the lights, where every choice was weighed against a perfect moment already past. In the years that followed, her roles demanded an uneasy balance, preserving public trust while protecting her professional identity. The tension did not explode. It seeped in. Fatigue accumulated. Doubt took hold. And the feeling of being seen but not understood, slowly, claimed its space. Karen was not unstable in the way headlines prefer. She was simply exhausted from being asked to remain the same. Within that silence, fractures in her personal life surfaced. A marriage strained under the rhythm of a career pulled in opposing directions. Private life eroded by shooting schedules and public expectation. There were no sensational headlines, only a deeply human reality. When the spotlight lingers too long, it reveals the weariness we once managed to hide. Karen Allen did not collapse. She stepped back, deliberately in small, conscious increments. Yet that retreat unsettled Hollywood, a star unwilling to keep playing the familiar game. And when the system no longer knows where to place you, silence begins to spread. As the spotlight began to feel suffocating, Karen Allen did not seek relief in another form of fame. Instead, she turned inward, toward the most private space of her life, her relationships. And it was there that familiar fractures became clearer than ever. In the late 1980s, Karen entered into marriage with actor Cale Brown. It was not a union built under spotlights or driven by ambition, but rooted in a deeply human desire to have a safe place to remain. Yet an unstable career, fragmented schedules, and a life constantly stretched between two worlds, public and private, slowly wore the relationship down. The marriage ended quietly, without scandal, without blame. Just another pattern Karen Allen knew too well. A place once believed to be an anchor, unable to last. After the divorce, she chose a path few in Hollywood dare to take, becoming a single mother. The birth of her son became the new axis of her life, and a clear boundary between herself and the entertainment system. Karen spoke little about her family life, never turning motherhood into a media image, but in reality, the decision changed everything. Her working schedule narrowed, her choice of roles grew stricter, and the spotlight was no longer an absolute priority. Off-screen, Karen Allen was very different from the public image once attached to her. She lived far from the center of Hollywood, devoting her time to theater, to teaching, to craft and handmade art, pursuits that generate no headlines but create a rhythm of life one can breathe within. There, she did not need to maintain an image or be loved in a prescribed way. She only needed to exist in alignment with her own pace. Looking back at Karen Allen's private life, there is something difficult to name. Every rupture unfolded in silence, and every retreat carried the shape of choice. No one was forced to leave. No one was abandoned in resentment. There was only Karen, consistently choosing to step back before losing herself. And that choice, repeated enough times throughout her life, transforms her story from a sequence of circumstances into something else entirely. It begins to suggest that a familiar rhythm has been quietly guiding every decision, a rhythm we have not yet, fully reached, even now. When Karen Allen's childhood, career, and personal life are placed side by side, a shared pattern begins to emerge, not loudly but persistently. It is not a fear of failure, nor a disillusionment with the craft. It is a protective instinct against structures that demand long-term surrender. From an early age, Karen learned how to live in motion. A childhood without anchors taught her a simple yet profound truth. Everything can disappear. Homes, cities, rhythms of life. The survival mechanism formed from that reality was not clinging, but preserving enough freedom to leave when necessary. That same mechanism allowed her to enter acting with a rare clarity, not dependent on validation, not confined to a single mold. When fame arrived, that mechanism remained active, and at first it was an advantage. Karen Allen was not swept away by the current of celebrity. She retained restraint, and with it the sense of authenticity audiences trusted. But at a certain point, what once protected her began to collide with the system itself. Hollywood operates on repetition. A successful image is meant to be reproduced. Karen, by instinct deeply ingrained, was simply not built to remain inside any fixed role for long. This is the aha moment. Karen Allen did not leave the spotlight because it wounded her directly. She stepped away because the spotlight demanded an identity contract. To remain forever, the beloved version of herself. And for someone raised in constant motion, that contract meant surrendering the right to change. When faced with the choice between continuing to be loved and continuing to be herself, Karen consistently chose the latter, quietly. Looking back, the same pattern repeats across multiple layers of her life. Whenever a structure became too rigid, Karen Allen consciously loosened it by stepping back. Not to escape, but to breathe. This explains how she could reach the peak without clinging to it. How she could remain remembered even without constant visibility. And at this precise moment, the story shifts its rhythm. Because once that pattern is understood, what comes next becomes clear. Karen Allen's change of direction was not a professional accident, but the inevitable result of the way she exists in the world. The remaining question is no longer, why did she disappear? But rather, having chosen to step outside the frame of fame, how would Karen Allen live within the quiet that follows the lights? Once the recurring choices across Karen Allen's life began to reveal their pattern, her next movements no longer appeared random. In the early 1990s, as Hollywood grew increasingly rigid around the machinery of stardom, Karen Allen began to narrow her presence, not through an announcement, but through very deliberate decisions. She did not abandon acting in a dramatic moment. Instead, Karen chose to recalibrate her pace. Large-scale film projects gradually gave way to theater, teaching, and work that did not demand constant public visibility. This was not a collapse, but a conscious retreat, one rooted in the understanding that remaining fully inside the system would require a cost increasingly distant from her true self. That decision was shaped by many forces: the invisible pressure of fame, shifts within the film industry, and a family life that now required full presence. But above all, it was a choice grounded in personal awareness. Karen Allen did not wait to be pushed aside. She stepped away before losing agency, exactly as she had done many times before in her life, quietly yet decisively. To Hollywood, that silence resembled disappearance. To Karen's own life, it was a way of staying with herself. No longer chasing an accelerated production rhythm, no longer maintaining an image frozen in time, she allowed herself to exist without the need for constant validation. And as the lights slowly dimmed behind her, the story did not end. Because this decision to change direction did more than reshape Karen Allen's career. It opened an entirely different chapter, where the central question was no longer, what role will she play next? But rather, when no longer standing before an audience, how does a person live with the choices they have made? When the spotlight was no longer the center, Karen Allen did not disappear in the way people often imagine. She drew inward, shifting into a rhythm of life where presence no longer needed to be validated by cameras or headlines. No more packed shooting schedules. No more questions answered on behalf of a public image. Only days unfolding at a deeply human pace. Karen lived far from Hollywood, choosing spaces where life moved more slowly. There, she devoted her time to theater, to teaching, to hands-on crafts that require patience, pursuits that generate no new stardom, but give weight to everyday living. Free from constant appearances, she allowed herself to be fully present in small, ordinary acts, as if relearning how to stay still after years of being pulled along by someone else's rhythm. What changed most was not her fame, but her way of being. Karen Allen no longer lived in anticipation of external response. Whether audiences remembered her or not, she continued to work, not to prove anything, but to keep a creative current unbroken. At this stage, acting was no longer a path toward peaks, but a carefully tended part of her inner life. Karen Allen's life after the lights held no shocking moments. It was not marked by awards or a loud return. Yet that very ordinariness carried its own meaning. She was no longer trapped inside the role her past had assigned her. She moved forward without denying what had been and without needing to live off it. And from a distance wide enough, one begins to see it clearly. There are people who only truly become themselves once they are no longer being watched. That quiet is not an absence. It is another form of presence, preparing the ground for what remains after everything. When looking back on Karen Allen's journey, the legacy she leaves behind does not appear as a list of achievements to be recited, but as something far harder to replace. A feeling of trust, that the characters she embodied did not exist merely to complete a story, but to remain in the viewer's memory as people who once truly lived. Karen Allen did not change cinema by creating a trend. She changed it by setting a standard. Before women on screen were allowed to be strong in a natural way, without declarations or explanation. She already existed that way. Before audiences grew accustomed to loving a female lead for emotional depth rather than spectacle, she brought that presence to the screen, quietly, yet convincingly. Her artistic legacy does not lie in the number of roles she played or the frequency of her appearances. It lies in emotional imprint. Her performances do not demand that audiences remember every detail, but they leave behind a feeling, the sense of a woman strong enough to stand on her own, vulnerable enough to be believed, and free enough to resist being confined. It is precisely that feeling that keeps her roles from aging, even as time passes. More importantly, Karen Allen leaves behind a rare legacy in Hollywood: the right to step away without being labeled a failure. In a system that often measures worth by constant visibility, she demonstrated that other paths exist. Paths where an artist does not need to turn themselves into an endlessly extended product. She did not shatter the spotlight. She simply stepped out of it, carrying her professional dignity intact. And so when the name Karen Allen is spoken again, it does not evoke the regretful "what if?" It evokes a deeper, quieter question. What allows a person to place real life above the very fame that once made their name? That question does not close the story. It keeps Karen Allen's legacy alive in a way uniquely its own. Karen Allen's story does not close with blinding lights, nor does it end in an easily told tragedy. It comes to rest in a silence long enough, a place where fame has receded, and a person is finally allowed to live without having to prove anything anymore. Karen Allen once stood exactly where Hollywood dreams of standing. But what sets her apart is not that she reached the peak. It is that she chose to step away from it while she was still loved. She did not fight the spotlight, nor did she flee her past. She simply chose to preserve what mattered most: the right to change, to slow down, and to be herself when the lights went out. Looking back on that journey, the question that remains is not, why did Karen Allen disappear? It is this: how many of us are brave enough to stop at the right moment before losing ourselves? And if you are searching for stories like this, stories of a quieter Hollywood, of fame without illusion, and of deeply human lives behind the lights, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us, because there are still many silences left untold,